compatriots, welcome. We've got a lot to get through today, and I'll get to that in a moment. It's also a very important morning in the life of the church and our culture, as Cardinal George Pell will be sentenced at 10 o'clock this morning in the county court. We might, if you're interested, we might cross to ABC News 24 at about 10:30. I think the judge is going to read out quite a bit of stuff between 10 and 10:30 before the actual sentence is given. Would you be interested to sort of see that? I think it's worth being connected to what's going on in our culture around us as we're reflecting on what we're doing. Because we're talking history really this morning as part of our story, and if we're ignoring history as it unfolds around us, that seems pretty silly. And the church is in crisis in our culture due to the current issues around child sexual abuse. Perhaps the greatest crisis maybe since Martin Luther nailed his 95 Theses to the church door. And so we need to be on top of that. So we'll do that. If you like, we can go and grab a cuppa and sit around and actually work together. Not for too long though, because otherwise we'll not get through what we need to get through. So let's just spend 5 minutes becoming present. I'm going to go through our awareness examine questions just briefly to remind you again that what we do together is a reflective practice, that whenever we consider what it means to be engaged in pastoral and spiritual care, we do so reflectively, and that will be picked up in our discussion of the traditions that our practice is based on today again as well. So just become quiet, prayerful, mindful in your tradition, and I'll ask you these questions. Thinking really just in terms of this morning, to think back to the moment you first became aware of yourself again, you woke up, and what's happened to you between then and now. I might like to ask this question: what has been given to me today? And how am I receiving what is given to me? Am I receiving it with wonder, gratitude, resistance, acceptance, hope, despair? What are my emotions, my feelings as I consider what has been given to me? What do I feel has come to me as a result of decisions I've made and actions I've taken? And how do I receive what has come to me this way? With gratitude, resistance, acceptance, regret, joy, shame? Or some other emotion? Considering my responses to what has been given to me and what has come to me as a result of decisions I've made, how are these things shaping the way I'm behaving today? And is there anything about me that I desire to change? And what are the roots of that desire? Hope, regret, determination, creativity, justice, fear. And now casting my mind into the future, how do I anticipate the responses and desires I've heard in myself will imprint themselves in my interactions with others during the day? Gently acknowledge all of this as a portion of my own inner life. I carry it with me into the world of activity and interaction. I offer it, my own stuff, carefully through my encounters with others, as an invitation to communion, not as a demand for conformity of the other to me, to make other people the same as me. I trust that I will find the wisdom and gain the insight to see when this portion of my inner life has inadvertently interrupted communion and become a demand on the other to conform. I accept that I am one small, important part of the whole of everything. Holding myself with wonder and awe, I trust that I will know the humility of moving over so that someone or something else will have the space for their portion of inner life to grow, flourish, and live. So really that prayer functions as a call for us to be mindful of ourselves in interaction with one another, something that we do as pastoral carers and indeed as students in a classroom. So I encourage you to bring yourself, your questions from your reading, from your life, from your ministry, your practice, into the classroom in interaction with one another, and to respect one another as we converse and disagree and learn from one another's journeys. Today we're going to trace some of the important people and ideas and moments in the story of what has become known to us as pastoral care, spiritual care. And we're going to go way back, and we can't cover everything, obviously, because the story is diverse and culturally diverse, diverse in ideas. For example, today I'm not going to cover the Catholic story in terms of the Ignatian tradition of spirituality and self-understanding. But there's a whole school of Ignatian thought on what spirituality is, what spiritual care is, and so on, that I encourage you to explore. But we're not going to explore it in class today simply because it's too much, and we're going to really look more specifically at the Western Protestant tradition. And that's because, partly because that's my story. And I say that unashamedly because what I want really today to be is not just a historical survey. Historical surveys can be incredibly dry, and I hope it's not going to be dry today, but really a question for all of us. What is my story? What brings me here? We touched on this last 2 weeks ago when we introduced ourselves, and we had various responses as to why I'm here in this classroom doing this class, and it may be as simple as, well, I have to because it's a prerequisite for everything else that I want to do. I don't have any choice. That's fine. And then you take a step back and say, well, why am I here at Stirling College? Why am I doing this particular degree, even if this unit is not necessarily my main interest? What am I here for? What is my story? Who are the people that have influenced me? What are the ideas that have influenced me? And Ben, I think 2 weeks ago, you beautifully said, I'm here because God told me to be here. which is a statement that has underlying. I'm just going to interpret what you said. You can. Which for me, I heard that as a statement under which there lies a story that involves people, it involves life experiences, it involves formation in family of origin, it involves formation in faith community, formation through text, the Bible and other texts, formation through culture, history, and so on. So God told me is an experience that has a whole number of factors that come together. And I only interpret what Ben said that way because it resonates in many ways with my own story. So in that way we can share and learn from one another. So yes, we're going to race through a whole bunch of ideas and people and all that sort of stuff, but ask that question, what is my story? And take notes for yourself. If you recognise ideas, if you recognise moments in history, people, or if you think, no, I don't recognise any of this, in actual fact my story's over here, note it down and interrupt and we'll have a conversation about it. Because history is only interesting to us by virtue of its capacity to enable us to tell our own story and to relearn our own ideas. I always say at the start of this lecture that when we do theology, whether it's pastoral theology, systematic theology, whether it's missions, whatever we're doing in this place, we will always encounter ideas that are new to us and that may profoundly challenge the understanding of God and the world and culture and history and so on that we bring with us. What I say to you, because someone said this to me, and it was very helpful to me, Greg Elston, in fact, who was the previous principal of the college, said this to me in my first theology class. You don't have to let go of anything you currently believe until you become aware of an idea or a worldview or an understanding that is so compelling to you that in order to reach out and grasp it for yourself, you need to let go of something. And you don't do that until you're ready. And it's kind of like this trapeze image, you know. You hold on tight to what you currently have, your current worldview, until you are so compelled, in that sense, to use perhaps religious language, so convicted of something else, that in order to embrace that, you need to let go in some sense, maybe partially or maybe completely, of what you held to be true or formative for you. So relax. You know, when I first came to theological college, I had 2 pages of doctrinal statements on the desk in front of me that I was not going to relinquish. That was it. I don't care what you teach me, I'm not relinquishing these doctrinal statements. And when Greg said this to me, I was able to relax. And that's not to say I began to disregard my doctrinal positions, but I relaxed enough to be able to engage openly in the conversation and begin to learn. And I'd lost that page of doctrinal statements in a couple of weeks. I wasn't so uptight about it that it became that important to me. Having said that, we are at university. So here's the other side of that coin. We are at university, we are not in a glorified Bible study. So if you've come to theological reflection and study thinking that this will be just like a great Bible study that will affirm everything I already believed, think again. University is and must always be a place of critical thought, a place of analysis and reflection on what we believe and what we think, and the capacity to think our way through to a robust, life-giving, relevant faith or way of being in the world today. So that's what we also do. We commit ourselves to a critical perspective. Do you know what I mean by a critical perspective? Do I mean negative? No. I mean the capacity to question, capacity to ask the questions, the capacity to say, does the premise support the conclusion? And if it's a weak premise, the courage to name it as a weak premise. So, and by virtue of that, to sort of demonstrate that, William James, who's a great philosopher, American educational philosopher, a couple of centuries ago, said this: a great many people think they are thinking when they are merely rearranging their prejudices. And that's what we want to avoid. What do you think he meant by that?
They're not allowing new thoughts or new things to come into their perception.
Yeah. So there are such tight boundaries around what they already think and believe that they're able to perhaps maybe gain some new perspectives on what they already think, but unable to explode their ideas when they encounter very new ideas. Imagination is crucial in this. And by imagination, I don't mean fantasising, I mean synthetic thinking. By synthetic, we mean when two very different ideas collide, and by the very virtue of the fact that new ideas are colliding with each other, we can find new ways of understanding. That's what we mean by synthesis. Synthetic. And that's what imagination can and should be. Alright, so what is our story? And as I said, I unashamedly lay claim to everything I'm going to say today as part of my own formation story, part of my own understanding of what it means to be a pastoral and spiritual care. I was called, and I use that word, called, because like Ben, I felt very strongly that God was calling me to ministry through the Baptist Church out here at Kilsyth South, and went through and studied at Whitby College and was ordained in the Baptist Church and spent 16 years in church ordained ministry in various churches around Victoria and Canberra. And through that, spent much of my time in that ministry, of course, in pastoral care of people. And when I moved away from church ministry, I moved into pastoral care for asylum seekers and in aged care and some other contexts like that, because the pastoral encounter became very, very important to me in my role. And when I try and trace back where my understanding of what I do comes from, this is where I go. So like I say, you don't have to go there with me. My story doesn't have to be your story. But let this tracing of my story firstly demonstrate what we do. We need to have a good understanding of our own formative foundations. And secondly, illuminate for you what your own people, stories, ideas might be. So let's start with the Hebrew tradition. Genesis 1 verse 2. The earth was formless and void, and darkness covered the face of the deep, while a wind, ruach, or the Spirit of God, from God, swept over the face of the waters. And I start here because the Hebrew tradition of life, ruach, spirit, is foundational for my understanding of what spirituality is. My understanding of spirituality is that it is life, as I've already shared with you. And life, wherever there is a living creature, a living organism, there is spirit. We'll go into that later in the course in some greater depth. But in the Hebrew tradition, and therefore in my tradition, because the Hebrew tradition underlies the Christian tradition, is formative for and still present in the Christian tradition. This for me is an image of the origins of life in the living Hebrew God, moving to create other life. Now this is important, and there's a bit of a nuance here for me, and that is that if God filled the universe to the exclusion of all others, there would be no life. There would only be God. But in this creative act, God, in a sense, moved out of the way, made some space, for other creatures to be. Which for me indicates that at the very heart of the divine life in Hebrew thought, there is a sense of humility, relational humility. There is space for the other to be. And I think for Christians this is evident in the Philippians 2 hymn, where Jesus, who being God, like God, didn't consider being like God something to be grasped after, but instead emptied himself of divinity and descended into the depths of the messiness of human beinghood, even unto death. You get that sense of emptying oneself in order to be in relationship with other living creatures. This is central to the Hebrew tradition, and so we could, using a Greek word retrospectively back onto the Hebrew tradition, say that in this act God demonstrated God's self to be possessed of kenotic humility. Kenosis is that Greek word in Philippians 2 that indicates self-emptying, that humility. And this goes to the core of spiritual care for me, because when we encounter others with the intention of offering them spiritual and pastoral care, we encounter them with the intention of listening deeply to them, paying attention to their particular spiritual journey, and creating the space for them to be, to discover their spiritual resources in their life and to flourish in that space. We don't fill that space with ourselves. When I encounter someone who I intend to offer care to, I don't just jump into the encounter and fill that with my own ideas about what they should do, who they should be, how they will get well, if only they became the same as me. And that comes back to the prayer that we prayed this morning. How can I be in a way that avoids my expectation that other people will always conform to me, will always be like me? That's the opposite of kenosis. It's not the spirit we find in the Hebrew creation story, the spirit of a God who wants other life to flourish. You kind of get where I'm going with that? Yeah? Want to make a comment? Question? Okay, we'll move on. Round about the same time, the Greek tradition is unfolding. And if we're talking divine understandings, we can probably trace our understanding of healing, spiritual care, wellness, flourishing, back to this divine person in the Greek tradition, Akiso, an important figure in this story because of her representation of the process of healing, rather than fixation on cure or therapeutic outcome. The process is important because in taking the time to focus on the process, we're able to be present to the whole human person. Asclepius, her father, the god of medicine, was very focused on the cure. Yeah? Akiso was focused on the process. What it means to be in the way of becoming well, of healing. And so the Greeks trace their whole pursuit of understanding what it means to be well, to flourish, to end suffering, and to live life full of happiness, really, can be traced back to this divine person. Why do we talk about Greek gods in a Christian theological institution? Because our tradition, whether we like it or not, is thoroughly mixed in with the tradition of Greek thought. And so we ask ourselves, in the pursuit of understanding ourselves, where does this stuff come from? Why is justice and happiness and wellness, why is healing important to us in the Christian tradition? And part of the answer to that is that all of the stories in the New Testament are contextually and historically situated in a Hellenistic culture. A culture thoroughly mixed with Greek ideas. Jesus himself though Jewish, was impacted by the Hellenistic ideas of his time and his culture. So it's really, really important that we follow the Greek tradition, and perhaps we could start with Plato and Aristotle and so on, who all had ideas about wellness and flourishing, human well-being and so on, and spiritual health. But we're going to go just a little bit further along from them and just have a brief look at the approach of these rather happy-looking people. It's a bit hard to look happy when you're in stone. By the way, interrupt me. Any questions, comments before we go on? Have I said anything that's causing great anxiety, or do you want to dispute? Come on! I'll get bored.
I'll get something.
Yeah.
Just in what you were saying about how that, like, I agree about the Hellenistic thought, and there's undoubtedly that Jesus and all that culture of that time were influenced by that.
Yeah.
But there's also, you were saying about how that the wisdom and the health and all that, and justice and all that. Well, that's still tied up in Hebrew.
Absolutely. Yeah. I couldn't agree more. And what we're talking about, of course, is a whole bunch of small states, cultures, national movements, and so on, who are all interacting all the time. So Hebrew tradition is recognisable in the Babylonian tradition, in the Egyptian tradition. You can see the same kinds of ideas moving in and around all of these cultures. So in this sense, it's when we talk about the Western tradition, we're talking about the collective thought, ideas, culture and religion of a whole bunch of different nations and cultures. Yeah, absolutely. Which is why I'm quite happy to bring both Hebrew and Greek, Christian and Greek ideas into the classroom, because they are not strangers to one another. They're profoundly present to one another. And in the New Testament is full of conversation between the Hebrew traditions of Christianity and the Greek traditions, and the intersection of Christianity and the Hellenistic world. The whole ministry of Paul is about the intersection of Hebrew thought with Hellenistic thought, and what it means to be a follower of Jesus in that context. Yeah. So they're important things for us to understand. And quite apart from that, in our culture today, spirituality is a broader than religious conversation, and it's important that we understand the basis upon which non-religious people understand themselves as spiritual, and the basis on which non-religious people understand themselves as spiritual carers. There's actually a secular humanist spiritual care network now in Victoria, and they consider themselves to be deeply spiritual people, and I agree with them. I think they are, and they consider themselves to be able to offer competent spiritual care. And many of them have their practice formed and based on ancient Greek philosophies and so on.
I was going to say, is that because we all ultimately have the same underlying things such as justice and mercy?
There are some core values, aren't there? Yeah. And I think those values are rooted in what the Hebrew tradition calls ruach, life. So the pursuit of life, we have learned over centuries of our human existence and evolution, involves certain things, and good, right relationship, just relationship, not only with others of our own species, but also with our environment. Those kinds of values underlie flourishing spiritual health. And we have particular faith language to put around that. We do that in a particular way. We follow a person who attempted to demonstrate in his life what that meant. Others do it differently. And as we listen, when we go, let's just say you become a pastoral carer in a hospital. You will be required to be present as a pastoral carer, a spiritual carer, to a whole host of different people in a public hospital, but even in a private hospital, a religiously based hospital. And you will need to be competent in creating space for them to tell their own spiritual story and draw on their own spiritual resources without limiting yourself to a religious narrative, which will say often, and this is a simplistic caricature, that the benchmark for human health is to be like Jesus or to have a relationship with Jesus. Therefore, if you want to be well, get a relationship with Jesus. Now, you may well believe that and absolutely live by that in your own life, and rightly so. Go for it. But as a spiritual carer, you are not providing spiritual care if you demand that of the people you're listening to, because you've then filled that space with yourself, your own narrative, your own story, and you haven't actually paid attention to the other person, like God's self actually did in creation, allowing the other to be another. So it's complex. You can be formed in listening by your own faith tradition, and that very formation enables you to pay attention to people who are different to you. Ben?
So if somebody was on their deathbed and they were being genuine, how can I get better? Like spiritually better, and you knew the answer was Jesus. How do you then go about it?
Well, you need to actually pay attention to them. You may well know the answer is Jesus.
Yeah.
Just like if you were a surgeon, you may well know the answer is further surgery.
Yeah.
But just as the surgeon would listen, I hope, to the patient who says, no, I don't want further surgery, thank you, because that's actually not life-giving for me. I would prefer to die in my own home and do it well now, rather than go through under the butcher's knife again. So we as spiritual care practitioners listen deeply to what brings flourishing life for that person at that time. And if we're so busy wrapped up in our own concerns for their eternal salvation, then we won't actually pay attention to them as a human person. Maybe this is controversial, I don't know, but I can't recall a time in the gospel stories where Jesus was so concerned about someone's personal salvation that he didn't pay attention to their overall health. In the end, God created each human person to be a free, autonomous agent. And at the very core, at least, of the Protestant traditions, is the human right of free choice and determination of one's own faith and life. And what we actually give to people when we pay deep, loving, compassionate attention to them and their story, we are actually, from a Christian perspective, giving them a demonstration of the gospel. Whereas if we're busy saying, you just got to get Jesus, you just got to get, just say this prayer, and you'll be okay. We're not listening. We're actually not being gospel. We're not being good news in that moment. Whereas if we are paying deep attention to them, offering them compassion, human presence, dignity, and listening, then we are implicitly being gospel to them in that moment. Does that kind of...
Yeah.
Is that the difference that Carrie Doran...
Carrie Doran?
That one?
Yeah.
She sort of differentiates between a pastoral carer and a spiritual director. Is that what she said?
Yeah.
Is that the difference? Like someone who perhaps is more direct, as Ben is saying, someone who's sort of speaking more about salvation in Christ, and the other person is sort of incorporating the other person's spirituality and going more into the sharing of...
So which one would you say? Would you say is which? Sorry.
Well, obviously, to me, being
Yeah.
a spiritual director, I suppose, is the one who goes out there and says, you need Jesus.
Right.
For salvation. You're the one, on your deathbed or wherever, I suppose going out there as an evangelist, basically. And then I think what the pastoral caring side is incorporating other people's spirituality as well in your conversation with them. So You're less
Yeah,
of a director. Is that, I mean,
well-
you seem to make a difference between those two.
Yeah, it's interesting. I can't actually recall what Carrie Dowring writes about spiritual direction. I came into spiritual care through spiritual direction as well. And my understanding of spiritual direction is that you sit with another person intentionally listening to their particular spiritual journey. It is also differentiated from evangelism because the spiritual director does not attempt to determine a faith outcome for the other person. They listen deeply with that person as that person does their own spiritual work. And the outcome is left open. You know, in a sense, it's between them and God. We listen, we offer one another the compassionate stance of shared listening in that space, an opportunity for the person to do the work themselves. Evangelism is very different, and there's a place for it within certain understandings of the church, but we can't confuse it with forms of, and I would say spiritual direction is a form of spiritual and pastoral care. Spiritual care, may not be pastoral in the sense that it's a function of the church necessarily, but it's, yeah. Is that kind of, yeah, it's
I
that.
just wanted to hear more about what you thought about that.
Yeah, I think spiritual direction is very much a spiritual care discipline. It's an open listening stance, yeah, and deeply rooted, of course, in the what they call the apophatic tradition, which is the negative theologies, silence, contemplative presence, openness, rather than seeking to determine a particular outcome for anyone.
How would you define evangelism?
Well, I think evangelism is, in my book, is a response to the nature of the gospel as it's outlined in the New Testament, and that is the proclamation of a new kingdom, a new way, a new understanding. And we'll look at a little bit at that shortly. The sense that in the gospel retelling of the Gospels as they retell the story of Jesus, Jesus is a person who came with an announcement. And the announcement was, there is a new way of being. The old way of being has not served us well. There is a new way of being. Come and join in. Come and follow me, Jesus said. And that to me is evangelism. It's a proclamation, you know, and Christians ought to be engaged in it unashamedly, as long as it is not misunderstood and misapplied as a form of coercion, which it often has been in the history of the church. So when it becomes mingled with fear, when it becomes mingled with harsh moral standards, and when it becomes a form of othering, so these people are in and those people are out, then it has ceased to have anything to do with the gospel as far as we understand it from the Gospels in the New Testament. It's become a function of religious demarcation, doctrinal demarcation. Yeah? You're out, you're not a Christian. You're in, you are a Christian. You're sinners, we're saved. Yeah? This kind of simplistic, moralistic demarcation of territory. I don't think Jesus was interested in it. I, in fact, don't actually believe that Jesus had any interest in forming a new religion. He never converted to another religion. He never started a religion as we understand it in the Gospels. He remained Jewish to the day he died, but proclaimed a new way of understanding the presence of God in community, the kingdom of God. And where is it? Gospel of Luke. Within you and among you, human community. That is non-exclusive. That is, in fact, so radically gracious that it seeks to include everyone who will simply say, wow, that's interesting. I'd be interested to come along and see what that life might look like. And in that sense, it's not that different to the early Greek Hellenistic philosophers who said, you know, the way we flourish in life is to seek to understand where our emotions and our passions come from so that we can get rid of the ones that cause us harm and maintain the ones that cause us life. That's very simplistically what the Hellenistic schools of philosophy were saying. You don't flourish in life by firstly seeking to ignore the fact that you have emotions, so you just push them down and ignore them, or secondly by blaming someone else like God or the gods. That's not how you flourish in life. So Epicurus and Pyrrho and Zeno taught in their own particular schools. Epicurus started the school of Epicureanism, indicating therefore that he may have had an ego problem. He was actually quite happy with himself, and he thought, he believed in people basically following him as their disciples. But his idea was interesting, and that was the good life is an examined life. A life in which we pay attention to the basis of the emotions that we have, and we take responsibility for them. We don't blame God. In fact, Epicurus said God is a wrong idea. And so the atheist, you'll often find an atheist these days, will be quite interested in Epicurus because he represents an ethical, moral and philosophical basis upon which a good, ethical, non-religious life could be formed. Do you see why this is important for us to understand this stuff? When we hear someone in our care as an atheist, it can be easy to think, oh, they're an atheist. No, they're not spiritual. I need to convert them. They need to become more spiritual. In fact, we would be guilty of not paying attention to what may well indeed be a very, very deep, ancient tradition, in fact, older than Jesus. So we need to pay attention to these things. Martha Nussbaum has written a fantastic book called The Therapy of Desire, and I gave you a chapter of hers to read. I hope you've had a chance to read that, and I encourage you to go on and read the whole book. It's a brick. Great for helping you get to sleep at night. But she said medical philosophy, which was really the approach of the Hellenistic philosophers, they believed that philosophy was a form of medicine. It was as important to the human life as was physiological medicine. Medical philosophy requires delving deep into the patient's psychology and ultimately challenging it and changing it. And by that, what Epicurus at least meant was he thought all your emotions are based on beliefs about yourself in the world. If you have wrong beliefs, your emotions are going to trip you over. So what you need to do is use philosophy to examine your beliefs, change your beliefs if they're causing you suffering, and your emotions will change on that basis, and you'll be happy. Sounds lovely, doesn't it? Now, it of course didn't fix humanity, we understand that. But the seed of the idea that is important in that is that spiritual care for us, for me, is about the well-examined life. There is an opportunity for every human person to take the time and the space to ask themselves some questions. Who am I in this context? I've just been told I can't go home to my home. I've broken my hip, I've gone to hospital, I've been told by the doctor I can't go home to my home, I have to go straight to a high care aged care centre. What are my emotions? What might they be? Got any ideas? Can you imagine? Ben?
Identity breakdown.
Identity breakdown? Absolutely. If my identity is tied up in my home, my place, if my family hub is there, that's where I cook my food, it's where I grow my food, it's where my pets are, it's where my neighbours are, it's where my shop is down the street where I go. A great deal of my identity is deeply wound up with my home, and I've just been told I will effectively never see it again. Just like that, because I fell over in the kitchen and broke my hip. Happens every day in Australia. It's a very common story. Now, the spiritual carer who is on the ward in the hospital with that person has an opportunity to do what?
Share the gospel.
Share the gospel? How do you share the gospel? Is that what you said? Sorry.
Yeah, I was going to say through action.
Through action. So So you might say the very fact that you are there, if you are coming at this from a Christian perspective, the very fact that you are there is you demonstrating your faith in that sense. I'm here because I actually care.
Yep.
Yep.
Listening to them.
Listening to them. Yep. Because they'll be surrounded by practitioners who are, the social worker is going to be organising the safety of the transition into the new place. The family are quite often going to be full on stressed out because it means, okay, we've got to sell the house, we've got to pack up the house, we've got to organise an aged care facility, we've got, so whilst loving their family member, they're consumed with all of these other concerns, doctors, nurses have their functions to play, and they will do those, and the person will be something of a number in that process. Yeah.
Do you think it's too early to give reassurance that everything's going to be okay? Is that being a little bit too bright?
Is it true?
Well, I'm thinking, is it more, because initial, is it better just to have that empathetic sort of listening ear rather than being too much of a, is it too early to be a reassurance to them at that stage, do you think?
Well, it's a fantastic question. And I'll just answer it simply, but it's a question we need to carry with us actually through the whole course. What is our function? Is our function, in fact, to provide reassurance or comfort at all costs? Which is a therapeutic outcome, isn't it? So the therapeutic outcome there is, my role is to help this person feel good regardless of their circumstances. And I think what we're suggesting, particularly as we talk about in a well-examined life, is that in actual fact that's not our role. It's a common one. And you know what it's based on? It's actually based on my own fear. Because when I come into contact with your suffering, I become afraid of it or anxious about it. And so what do? I try and save you from it, not because I'm interested in saving you, but in actual fact, even if I'm not aware of it, because I'm interested in soothing my own fear and my own anxiety. It's the classic, oh, don't worry, you can have more children, you're young, when your child dies. Or it's the classic, don't worry, you'll go to heaven. Because, and look, you may think that's true, but that's just got nothing to do with it. What's actually true and real in the moment is that this person is suffering. And you, as a spiritual care practitioner, are called to pay attention to the suffering. Hear it, see it, validate it. It is valid suffering. It's there for a reason, and it is integral to human dignity that you respect that person's suffering and be with it. So it's a fantastic question because it takes us right to that idea that we can actually be accidentally driven by our own fears and anxieties in the way we're attentive to other people, which is why we ask ourselves, what's going on for me? I know I have to visit someone with cancer this morning, and I'm terrified of cancer, because my dad died of cancer or whatever. And I'm carrying that into my caring relationship with someone else. How might it incidentally or accidentally or subconsciously drive the way I'm responding to that person? Oh, I'm sure there'll be a new cure soon. They're doing lots of research. Oh, I'm sure you'll be okay. You'll be right. You're a fighter. I know you're a fighter. All of this kind of jollying along language, which is in actual fact not paying attention. You're filling the space with yourself, not creating space for the other person to be. Typical example, just a very simple example of a minister that shared with me once when he went to the hospital, and a woman from his congregation was sitting in the corridor, and her daughter was very, very sick, near to death, and she was consumed with anger. And she turned to him and she said, I think I've lost my faith because I'm angry with God. And I'm not supposed to be angry with God. And he's simply said to her, try telling God that.
Wow.
If God is God, God is big enough to cope with your anger. And so she just poured out her anger. And he said to her, your anger is a valid expression of your faith. The fact that you can be that intimate now with your God means you have a robust faith, a robust relationship with the person you believe created you. So he validated her. Firstly, he made space for her anger. He gave her the courage to express it in the context of the relationship that was most important to her, her particular God. And he validated her as a faithful person in the midst of all of that. He didn't try and rescue her. He didn't say, oh, you should just trust in God. You should, God will, if you do this or that, or you say this or that, God will rescue you. Or maybe you just haven't had enough faith. Maybe you need to have more faith if God's going to respond and heal your daughter. All these kinds of ways and means that we use to try and avoid the reality of the situation. There's a guy called Karl Mannheim. I haven't put him in this slideshow. He was a sociologist from last century, and he wrote a book called Ideology and Utopia. And he described ideology like this. Let me try. I've got to try and remember it exactly. Ideology is any idea or belief that we persist with, intentionally persist with, because the truth does not suit our purposes. Did you hear that? Yeah. So I persist with this idea. It's kind of like a fantasy, isn't it? I persist with this fantasy because the truth that I actually happen to also be aware of, at some level, doesn't suit my purposes. And it's kind of that spiritual dynamic that we're in danger of bringing into a pastoral care encounter if we don't live an examined life. And this is kind of what the Hellenistic people were on about. You don't ignore your own stuff, you understand it. You seek to understand it. And we, as pastoral and spiritual carers, do this for ourselves. We seek to understand ourselves. We don't try and force the other person to understand themselves, or we don't tell them what they need to understand about themselves. We create the space for them to examine themselves. So this is why the Hellenistic medical philosophical approach is so important. This approach must find ways to delve into the inner world using gripping examples, techniques of narrative, appeals to memory and imagination, all in the service of bringing the pupil's whole life into the investigative process. I just put one of Epicurus's principal doctrines down there because it's a good little demonstration of the sorts of philosophical activity that he invited his community to share in. And it simply says there, as you can see, the wealth required by nature is limited and is easy to procure. But the wealth required by vain ideals extends to infinity. Now, can you hear the invitation in what he's saying? There is a right belief and a wrong belief. The right belief is, in actual fact, if you want to live, your needs are fairly limited. You don't need much. You need a bit of food, you need some clothes, and you need some shelter. Easy to procure, and if you believe that that's what life consists of, then you will be happy, because it will be easy for you to do that. However, if you believe in vain ideals, for example, like corporate world domination, Google or whatever it is, that kind of wealth is difficult to procure and extends to infinity. And Epicurus said, on the basis of that belief, you will never be happy because you will never be satisfied. So philosophy says, understand what you believe about life and yourself. And in the understanding of it, you will be transformed. So Epicurus, who wasn't completely dispossessed of vain ideals himself, formed a little community in a garden, and they all attempted to live, in actual fact, very, very simply. Epicurean philosophy it's a materialist philosophy, doesn't believe in the gods or supernatural life at all, and it's often thrust aside by religious perspectives because it's said to be hedonistic, pursuit of pleasure. But that's a simplistic misrepresentation of the school. What they were on about was adjusting their beliefs so that they could live simply and achieve happiness in simplicity. So there you go. That's the Hellenistic approach, and they believed with Goya. Does anyone remember this etching by Francisco de Goya, 1799? The sleep of reason produces monsters. So the idea being that if you don't do this, if you don't live a reflective life, you will end up being driven by subconscious monsters, fears, anxieties, dysfunctions, experiences that have formed you in ways that you're not aware of, that are driving your behaviour. And the studies that we've done into trauma, or that are being done in trauma and neuroscience and trauma and so on, are revealing more and more about the way our traumatic experiences throughout life actually shape our brains, the way our brains interact with our bodily signals and so on. So in this etching, Goya comments on the emergence and the proliferation of social and individual evils that occur when reason reflection is suppressed in favour of ideology that protects the agendas of the powerful. It corresponds well with the Hellenistic project for philosophy. Philosophy is the opposite of the sleep of reason. Rather than suppress the emotions and passions, understand them and gain power over the hidden forces that drive you. How are we going? It's 10:30. It's time for a cuppa. So why don't we pause? Do you want me to put on News 24 just for 10 minutes or so while you grab a cuppa, and or is it going to be too heavy? Let's have a go. Eh? But now's the time to spend 10 minutes or so grabbing a cuppa, going to the loo.
Are you going to make it better?
No,
Sorry, I'll take it. I have to bring myself back.
That's a very good question.
I don't handle it myself. I just figured that out.
Have you seen the handbook?
It'll be, because I figured out that we have reply to your email and you send it to us.
That's the forum. But if you want I do have the email address there.
Somewhere there?
Yeah, but it's alright, I'll give it to you now.
Yes, please, so hang on.
It's just, C. Turner.
Is it a doctor?
No, just C. Turner.
Okay.
That's Stern.org.
No. I know I'm going to have a chat to a cheaper.
Beth?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, with another person here. So
Yeah,
just want to understand. So all of this kind of is going on. Just how is this going to come out?
Yeah.
I don't want to.
Yeah. Okay.
What do you do? Because the only thing in my mind is like, okay, does this sound is too perfect?
With the book report, you mean? Yeah.
So reading the book, what was expected to do?
So if you go into the handbook's really, really helpful. So each assessment task is outlined with exactly what you need to do.
Yes, the questions, right?
Yeah, the questions, but also the book report actually, the assignment actually outlines what's required of you in that book report, because it's only a very limited number of words.
Yeah, I can see that.
Yeah, so if you read that carefully, that should give you enough.
Carefully, yeah. In terms of the bibliography, how many come there, like, maybe read this book and read through it.
I'd be happy if you drew on,
Like half another.
if you just drew on the readings, the other readings that you do for the course so far, and you brought in some of the other, so the readings that are there for each week of the course. So you go into ARC and you see the readings folder. Just use those. So you're already reading them. You know what I mean? To use what you're already reading, and use that to just sort of bring in other comments and supporting ideas to what you say about carry down. Yeah.
Oh, so no wonder that the art of carry kind of just went all over. I was like, okay, what just happened? Okay.
Yeah. So don't.
Okay, that's really
Yeah.
because I come into the library and all these people look at me.
Yeah.
Well, there's no time to read all of this.
Yeah.
So it's just creating panic for no apparent reason.
Yes.
So I just want to kind of get that.
The main focus of this task of the book report is to demonstrate that you've read the book, you've understood the book, and that you can say something about your own views in relationship with other readings and stuff. Yeah.
Okay.
But if you read that outline in the handbook,
Yeah.
that'll help. Yeah.
Okay.
And if you're still concerned, just send
Oh,
me
yeah.
an email. And
Oh, yeah.
yeah. I need sound with me.
You are?
Is the sausage still today, is it?
I think so.
Yeah, you're probably right.
We have a look. No, next week.
Oh, next week.
You're a little bit eager, huh?
Oh,
You're okay.
we've got internet. We must have.
What is that? I think it's got the speakers too loud.
I just had,
7.
I had to push
While
the
I
button.
consider that your offending was intimately connected with your duties and role as Archbishop, and the victim's duties and roles as choir boys, on any view, you seized upon the opportunity presented to you to interact with the victims within the cathedral setting